What's up everybody, thanks so much for checking out the video. We're back here in my SubaruONLY shop here in Northern California, and in today's video, I'm going to walk you guys through how I use a heat gun to cure the surface of that intake manifold that we painted with that red STi wrinkle colored paint. Thanks again for checking out the video guys. I'm Luke, this is the SubaruONLY show. This is my little SubaruONLY shop. It's a DIY Subaru channel. It's a channel where all I do is Subaru builds and race Subaru vehicles in motorsport events. It's a DIY themed channel where I walk you guys through the steps to get your Subarus back on the road and hopefully do a little racing of your own. So thanks for checking out the video guys. I really appreciate it. Okay guys, if you didn't catch my last video, this is actually the product that we used to paint this intake manifold with a red STi wrinkle colored finish. It's a VHT product and it's a red colored, high temperature, wrinkle coat paint. Now if you look on the back of this can and read the instructions, VHT says to cure this paint, you actually want to bake it in an oven at 200 degrees for a minimum of 1 hour. But you actually don't want to do that in your kitchen oven because this paint can off-gas toxic fumes and you don't want to mix that with any of the food that you'll be consuming at a later time. So you're going to have to find another way to heat this finish up to 200 degrees to fully cure it. Now the option most people go with is they pick up an extra oven and they use that oven in their workshop or in some kind of commercial setting. And that works fine. And if you have an oven, go ahead and use that option because that's probably the fastest and the easiest way to cure this part and to get a really good finish. But a lot of you guys out there might not have an extra oven, but you might have a heat gun. And if you have a heat gun, you can actually use that heat gun to cure that surface at 200 degrees for at least an hour. And that's what I have set up right here behind me, and that's what this video is going to be all about. I'm going to walk you guys through how you can use a heat gun to fully cure the surface of that recently painted part. Now there's actually two fundamental ways you can go about doing this. You can actually blow hot air over the exterior of the surface and cure it that way, or as one of you guys out there in the SubaruONLY community pointed out in the comments recently, you can actually use the heat gun to blow hot air inside the intake manifold and cure it from the inside out. And that's a really cool option. I'm going to go ahead and try both ways today for this video. Now in the first option that I talked about, where we blow hot air over the exterior of this surface, the first questions that I ran into is what setting should I have my heat gun set at, and how closely should I have that gun positioned to my intake manifold. And to answer that question, I actually realized I need to have a thermostat or a thermometer so I can measure the temperature of that air that would be hitting the surface of that intake manifold. So I jumped in my car, I went to the local hardware store, and I went for the kitchen accessories aisle to find myself one of those oven thermometers.
This might work. 200 degrees. Oven thermometer, $9.99.
And this is the thermometer I found. This sucker is going to work perfect. It's got a range of 100 to 600 degrees, so it'll capture that target temperature of 200 degrees perfectly on this gauge and be really easy to read. The next thing I set up was this ruler. That way I have an idea of how far away from the surface that heat gun tip should be positioned. Okay, so let's take a closer look at this setup. And I'll go ahead and turn that heat gun on, and we'll watch that thermostat rise from 0 degrees up to around the 200 degree point, and then I'll let it set for 5 or 10 minutes. That way we know we're at a fixed 200 degree temperature with that hot air that's blowing over this intake manifold. Okay, now here's my setup. And as you can see, I've got that intake manifold on a piece of plywood, and I've got this heat gun propped up above that intake manifold. This heat gun is a Black & Decker Heat Pro Deluxe 2. It's actually got two settings, 1 and 2, and then it's got a temperature dial on top, from low to high. Then here's that oven thermometer. That oven thermometer has a range of 100 to 600 degrees, and we're actually going to be targeting 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so I'm going to turn this heat gun on, and we're going to watch that thermostat rise from that 0 degree temperature range up to around 200 degrees. Okay, now the heat gun's on. That's that sound in the background. And as this heat gun warms up, that stream of hot air is blowing over that oven thermostat, and that will tell us how hot this air is when it hits that intake manifold to cure that red wrinkle coat paint. Okay, now as you can see, that thermostat is slowly rising. It's at about 150 degrees Fahrenheit now. And I'm going to leave it here until we have an idea of what the static temperature is and where that needle stops rising. Alright, this little needle is continuing to climb, and we're at about 175 degrees Fahrenheit. Alright, that needle is now right about 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're going to leave it here for another 5 or 10 minutes so we have an idea if we've got a static temperature range, because that VHT paint wants to cure at that 200 degree range. Now another thing I'll mention is that I have a socket underneath this little thermostat, and the reason I have that socket there is because I want to raise that thermostat up to about the height of where this intake manifold paint surface is. So the way I have it set up right now, it's about the same distance away from that heat gun that this intake manifold surface will be. Okay, now it looks like it's fairly static at about 225 degrees. Now that's a little bit hotter than the instructions on the back of that VHT can were requiring. So I'm going to lift this heat gun up and move it a little bit further away from this surface. That way we'll hopefully drop this temperature just a little bit closer to that 200 degree Fahrenheit mark. Now it looks like this distance is actually going to be just about perfect. We've dropped that temperature from about 225 degrees Fahrenheit to about 200 degrees Fahrenheit by raising that heat gun just a few inches. So let's take a closer look at the ruler and let's get an exact idea of how far away this heat gun is from this intake manifold surface. Now if you take a closer look at this ruler, you'll see that this intake manifold actually comes up to about the 5-inch mark. And then if you look at the height of where this heat gun tip is, that's actually at about the 14-inch mark. So subtract 14 from 5, and that gives you about 9 inches. So for this heat gun, right around 9 or 10 inches away from that painted surface is perfect to cure that paint at around 200 degrees Fahrenheit. But this is all dependent on exactly the settings I have for this heat gun and my ambient temperatures in this room. So for your room and your heat gun, it might be slightly different. This Black & Decker heat gun is set to its lowest temperature setting, but the number 2 blower setting. So it's blowing the most air it can blow, but it's at the lowest temperature that air can be heated to. That setting, in combination to keeping that heat gun tip around 9 or 10 inches away from my intake manifold surface, seems to be about the perfect temperature, setting, and distance combination to cure this red wrinkle coat paint at that 200 degree target temperature, and I can easily leave it here for at least an hour. Now there's actually a second option you can use if you want to use a heat gun to cure this red wrinkle coat paint. One of you guys from the SubaruONLY channel gave me a really good suggestion, and you said you can use that heat gun by blowing that heat directly into that intake manifold, and that way you actually heat the metal surface of that intake manifold and you cure that paint from the inside out. Now I think that's a really interesting idea. I've actually never thought of it and I've never heard of it before, but I think it's a brilliant idea. Because if you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense to cure it this way, from the inside out, if you think about the way paint cures. When you blow hot air on the outside of that paint surface, you're actually evaporating the moisture that's in that layer of paint. And you're evaporating that moisture from the outer layers first. And if you evaporate moisture from the outer layers first of that paint surface, you're actually hardening that surface, and you're making it harder for the moisture to get evaporated from the lower layers of that paint surface. Now in contrast to that, if we use a heat gun in this method, where we're blowing the heat inside the intake manifold and we're heating the walls of that intake manifold to around 200 degrees, and that way we cure the paint from the inside out, that will allow the water to evaporate from that paint layer from the lower layers first, before those outer layers harden. And that way, I think you might actually get a more complete water evaporation from that paint compound. So I'm really excited to test this method. I'm going to go ahead and flip this heat gun on, and we're going to see how hot the air is coming out of that intake manifold. Now I realize this isn't going to be a very accurate way to measure the temperature of that metal surface that's curing the paint, but this is the closest way I have to measure the temperature of the air going in and out of that intake manifold. That way we can get some idea of how hot that metal surface is, and hopefully get somewhat of an idea of how hot we're curing that red wrinkle coat paint at. Okay, so let's flip this sucker on. Let's get a better idea of how hot that exiting air is after this heat gun has been warmed up and it's at a static temperature. Right now it's at the same settings that I had for the first method, and that is the number 2 blower setting, so the highest volume of air it can blow, but at the lowest temperature setting. Alright, this sucker's on. That's what that buzzing sound is in the background. So I'm going to let it warm up to temperature, and I'm going to go ahead and keep an eye on this thermostat. I've actually rotated this thermostat sideways so you can see that 200 degree reading a little bit better. And we'll keep an eye on this thermostat, and we'll watch to see how hot that air gets coming out of that side of the intake. Now of course I'm losing a lot of hot air at all these other ports, but what the hell, we've got the thermostat here, so let's go ahead and measure that air. Now you might think, why don't I just block off all those other ports? That way all the hot air will actually come out of this one port and I can measure that thermostat. But if I do that, I'll actually have uneven heat flow through these ports. And I actually want that heat that's coming in from that heat gun to travel throughout this intake manifold evenly. That way I heat those inner walls evenly, and I can cure that red wrinkle coat paint evenly. So I'm going to go ahead and leave all these ports open, and we're just going to keep an eye on this thermostat and see if we can get any idea of how hot the air is coming out of this sucker. But either way, for my previous experiment with that first method, where I was blowing the hot air on the intake manifold from the outside, I know that this heat gun puts out a stream of air that's higher than 200 degrees temperature if you're within 8 or 9 inches. And right now this heat gun is pointing directly into this intake manifold, so that stream of air that's coming out of this heat gun at that low temperature setting is definitely in the high 200s, which means that intake manifold is going to be heating up to around that 200 degree Fahrenheit range. So I know that layer of red wrinkle coat paint that's on top of this aluminum intake manifold is definitely seeing heat in a range of 200 plus degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, if we look at this little thermostat, we're actually rising up and we're getting close to the 150 degree Fahrenheit range. Okay, I've still got the heat gun on, and this thermostat has settled at right around 107 degrees Fahrenheit. But the reality is, this thermostat is supposed to be completely submersed in heat to give an accurate reading. And I suspect that because half of this thermostat is on the outside of this intake manifold and it's not being heated, and only the back half is getting heated, that this thermostat is not actually giving an even reading of the temperature of the air that's coming out of this intake manifold. And I actually don't have a thermostat that I can stick up in this port to get a better idea of the temperature of this air. But I'll bet that the temperature of this air is somewhere in the 200 to 250 degree range. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this heat gun on for about an hour, and I'm going to heat this intake manifold up from the inside out. That way, this red wrinkle coat paint can cure by evaporating that moisture content from the lower layers of that paint out to the outer layers of the paint. So that's it. Those are your two methods. Use your heat gun from about 9 or 10 inches away from your surface, or use that heat gun and blow from the inside of that intake manifold and heat it from the inside out. For those of you guys out there who don't have a second oven, I hope this gave you guys an option to cure that red wrinkle coat paint. And these methods I've gone over in this video should really work for anything you paint that has to be heated to around 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Thank you so much for checking out the video, guys. If you have any questions or comments, please leave in the comment section. If you like this video, please go ahead and give it a like. I'm Luke, this is the SubaruONLY Show. Until next time, guys, later!